Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Ronald Wintrobe. Probably for many of you, he doesn't need any introduction, but for those who do, uh, Ron has been a professor of economics all his life at the University of Western Ontario, now called Western University in Canada, and he's now emeritus professor there. He has worked all his life on a wide variety of topics, all within the broad field of public choice or political economy, beginning initially with the economic theory of bureaucracy, which is a good classic public choice theme, and then moving on to the political economy of dictatorship, on which he was perhaps the first to publish a well-known book and to sort of establish the field of that field of research long before the rise of Acemoglu, Robinson, and the others. And he's been working on dictatorship and generally authoritarian regimes all the time since, including today, because there is it's a topic that keeps being important and timely, as we know, as we can all see. Other than that, he also addressed an economic approach, a rational approach to political extremism and religious extremism, including, in particular, Islamic extremism, all of which was brought within a framework that started from rational choice and tried to include social relationships, social interactions, and other, in a way, non-standard angles from which to look at the problem. I should also mention that years ago, Ron and I jointly edited a collective book on the political economy of theocracy, which is to this day one of the very few works by economists on that topic. Although it didn't make a great splash, but it's still there. So I think that's basically enough. I think we can leave the field to Ron and hear him about how economic man or woman got the blues, which is still like a follow-up to his traditional line of research. So, Ron, it's you.
So this is a paper about
Okay.
how economic man and woman got the blues. And how this thrill went out for many people. And part of the reason that they got the blues is the kind of personality that's assumed in standard economic theory. Standard economic theory is mostly focused on the behavior of markets, but economic agents do have a minimal personality. Their utility depends only on their own consumption. There's a rate of time preference, degree of risk aversion, and so on. But because they only consume, their only relationships, the only kind they have, are market relationships. And so their behavior is not based on the behavior of other people unless that behavior is mediated through prices. But as you know, there are many other kinds of relationships: friendships, status, group memberships, love, envy, identification, conformity, and anger, and so on. Public choice makes the same assumption about people. In this case, it's the relationship between a citizen and a politician, and that relationship is assumed to be just one of exchange. You vote for a politician or a party, they promise policies. You vote for the one that's closest to the one that you desire, and in exchange, you get policies from the government. Again, people only care about their own consumption of the policy supplied to them, and the behavior of others is not typically considered. But relationships in politics, where goods are often public goods and decisions are made collectively, are probably even more important than they are in economic life. I used to think that that characteristic personality assumption, that minimum assumption that utility depends on own consumption, was kind of harmless. It seemed very minimal, and that's the way it's often thought of. But in this paper, I want to show that that's not true. That standard results like the Coase theorem, the case for free trade or economic growth, get overturned when a more social personality is assumed and you allow social forces into the analysis. The paper also goes on to explain the rise of authoritarian populism, which again, I argue the standard model can't do. So I suggest that this way of thinking that is incorporating social forces into the analysis can explain a lot of things that standard models can't. I'm not the first to look at this. There's lots and lots of excellent work by brilliant people about social forces and social relations. There's Akerlof's identity theory, Becker's work on social interactions, the relative income hypothesis, happiness studies by Bruno Frey and others, which generally show that the more clubs you belong to, the happier you are, and so on. And in particular, there was a lecture at this year's AEA meetings by Emmanuel Saez on our social nature that I recommend to all of you. In other social sciences, there's other work where people are assumed to value relationships. And sometimes these are bundled into a characteristic personality. The most famous of these undoubtedly was a character called the Organization Man, put forth in a book by William White in 1956. And there, the Organization Man was assumed to have one particular and important relationship outside his or her family, that is loyalty to the company. The way you got ahead was being loyal to the company. The standard example of a company at that time was General Motors, and so on. In 2000, Robert Putnam argued and presented massive amounts of evidence. If you've never seen the book, the amounts of evidence presented there about the increasing isolation of people in the US is very well worth looking at. And so he'd argued that people had changed. They didn't have relationships anymore the way they used to. And then very recently, last year, there was a book by journalist Nicholas Lemon, who argued that Organization Man, that type of worker in the US, had been replaced by a guy he called Transaction Man, who has no relationships other than market type relationships, even within the firm. In this paper, I'm going to use the terms economic man, which is the character you all know, or economic woman, and transaction man or transaction woman interchangeably. That's a little different than the way Lemon uses those terms. So despite all of this work and much more that there isn't time to cite, I think the simple implications of this idea, that is that people value relationships as well as own consumption, for standard economic theory and the standard kinds of policies that we haven't been spelled out. And to do so, I'm going to first very quickly outline a very simple model of a person who has relationships and whose behavior depends on them, that is, on the behavior of others. And then I'm going to go very quickly to applications of these ideas, including the Coase theorem, crime prevention, economic growth and free trade, and authoritarian politics. So here's a very simple model. People are assumed to maximize utility. It depends on own consumption, as before, and also on relationships. And I distinguish two kinds, excuse me, two kinds of relationships: work relationships, RW, and purely social relationships, RS. And those relationships Relationships can be status relationships, for example, relative income. That is, you're happier when your income is higher relative to that of other people, and not just its absolute level. Or belonging relationships, or community friendship, community relationships, friendship, and so on. Of course, relationships and belonging are not free. There's a cost to building and maintaining them. Now, you can't buy relationships like trust and belonging, as I've long argued, but you can invest in them. And the cost, I'll just assume that you can measure the cost of investing in relationships in terms of the time spent building them up. And I'll assume there are simply prices Q and S for work relationships and for social relationships, respectively. And so every household maximizes utility subject to a very simple constraint, which you see there. So W is the wage rate. The total amount of income is the total amount of time available, T, minus leisure time. So that gives you income. So that's how you get your income. And then the right-hand side shows how the income is spent, either on consumption at the price P, or on investing in work relationships, RW, at the price Q, or investing in social relationships, RS, at the price S. And maximizing the utility function subject to the constraint, you can see very standard looking first order conditions. The marginal utility of consumption divided by its price is equal to the marginal utility of social relationships divided by its price. The marginal utility of consumption divided by its price is equal to the marginal utility of work relationships divided by its price. There's a slight complication if having more relationships at work tends to increase your wage in the future, which seems reasonable. So you see the price in the lower right-hand side of equation 4, Q, the price of work relationships is less if building them up raises your wage rate. So there's a slight difference there. So economic woman will also build relationships at work because they might raise his wage or her wage in the future, even if they don't enter a utility function directly. But he or she will do so less than people who also get utility, direct utility from relationships. So the only point of this model is just to show that you can incorporate relationships into economic theory. You could then go further, build a little general equilibrium, standard general equilibrium model using these equations. And so there's no issue from the modeling point of view in incorporating them. So let's go to the examples. Here's the first one, the Coase theorem. You all know what it is. Take a simple example. We're driving in a car. I'm with a friend. I want to smoke. My friend doesn't want me to. If I've just read Coase, and I did this once, I could ask, how much is it worth to you to allow me to smoke? It's worth $10 for me to have this cigarette, so I'll offer you $9 to let me smoke. If it's worth less than that to you, you'll let me smoke, take the $9, we'll both be better off. That's what Coase says. We're friends, so the transactions cost must be low, so the theorem should go through. But in fact, what I suggest is going to happen if you try this is the person will say, what kind of a friend are you? Where you offer me money in order to let you smoke in the car, and so on. And he might think that I think of the relationship purely in terms of transactions, and he might think it's not as good a relationship as he or she thought before. But if we were both transaction men and women, then the theorem would go through. So you see right away that the Coase theorem implicitly assumes that people are transaction men and women, or strictly economic men and women. Their behavior or their utility doesn't depend on their relationships with others. Example 2 is a little deeper. So I don't know how many of you know about the model of broken windows, which was introduced in New York City by New York City's first black mayor, David Dinkins, a long time ago in the 1980s. It began in the subway system, and the idea was that small signs of disorder, that is, broken windows in a neighborhood, graffiti in the subway, these small signs of disorder made people think that the area was unsafe. And so, for example, people weren't using the subway in New York because they thought it was dangerous. When I went to New York in '86, a friend of mine told me, don't ride the subway at night. So this whole idea was to police minor crimes, to make the area and the community feel safe. And in neighborhoods, the whole idea was that the cops got out of their cars and walked the beat again in order to build trust between the police and the community. And in the book by Kelling and Coles, they gave examples. They were both criminologists of, for example, a white police officer taking down a black man on a street in front of a bunch of black people who all supported him for doing this because they knew him and he knew them, and they knew he wouldn't do it if it wasn't justified. So that was the idea, the concept. And it was very, very successful at lowering crime. So the drop in the crime rate in the late 80s in the United States was very dramatic, and it continued to fall for a long, long time. When Rudy Giuliani, that is the same Rudy Giuliani that you hear about these days, became mayor of New York, he didn't understand the community aspect of the broken windows theory and converted it to what's sometimes called stop and frisk, where policemen just randomly stop people, usually minority people, and ask, what are you doing here? And so on, and frisk them. And it changed the nature of the policy completely from one which was community oriented to one where there was a relationship of dominance of the police over members of the community, particularly members of minority communities. And so Giuliani implicitly assumed people were transaction men and women. We've seen in the most dramatic fashion in the last year or so just how negative the effects of the policy have become of stop and frisk, where police randomly stop people and where there is no relationship between the police and the community except dominance, and resulting last week in the trial of Derek Chauvin and the examples that are very familiar from the daily news. So it's a very interesting example of a program that initially was based on understanding social forces and policing minor crimes in order to make people feel safe and build trust between the community and the police. And it gets morphed completely into what virtually is its opposite. And so it's a good example. Here's another good example, the financial crisis. So this is 2007. Alan Greenspan is revered as the head of the United States Federal Reserve. There was a housing bubble. In the famous analysis by Robert Shiller, who subsequently got the Nobel Prize for this, the housing bubble itself was something autonomous. It had nothing to do with anything else except the fact that housing prices were going up. People saw that. They assumed that they would continue to go up and that other people were buying houses, and therefore they should buy a house. And so the belief that housing prices are destined to keep on rising became contagious. If Greenspan had understood that, he could have stopped the transmission of the belief that they had to keep on rising. But as Shiller notes, and as Greenspan writes in his own autobiography, he and others in the Fed were unwilling to look at social contagion mechanisms in making policy. And so they couldn't see the bubble. They assumed everyone was like economic men and women. And so the crash happened. here's a different example. And here we're going to do a little welfare economics, which I don't normally do, but I think it's worth pursuing. So it's well known that trade liberalization, free trade, or the promotion of economic growth, policies like this don't satisfy the simple Pareto criterion. The reason is that obvious, some people are made worse off by them. The justification for the policies is that they're held to satisfy the potential Pareto criterion, the Kaldor-Hicks criterion, namely that aggregate wealth is increased. And so in principle, the gainers could compensate the losers and still remain better off themselves. And these are the usual grounds for recommending the policy, while leaving it to the government to decide what, if anything, to do for those who are made worse off by the policy. But now let's incorporate status relationships into the analysis. And let's make, first of all, a very strong assumption. Suppose that the government actually compensated those people who were made worse off after the introduction of a policy like deregulation or free trade. Then on standard Pareto grounds, the policy appears to work. The losers are compensated, the government gives them a handout, and the winners are better off. But if in fact the people who lose by the policy are people who are interested in relationships, they used to have a job, they have some status in the community, they would come home from work and exhibit that status. They belong to clubs where everybody's working and they talk about their work and they get status from that. Now what they get is the check from the government. They're compensated economically, but their status is worse. And so the policy doesn't satisfy the Pareto criterion, even with full compensation. But that's not the most important point. The most important point is that it won't satisfy Kaldor-Hicks either. If the loss in status by the newly unemployed overwhelms the gain to those who benefit from the policy, then the winners can't compensate the gainers once you include the loss of status. And it's very likely true that more or less this is what has been happening in the United States in the last 30 years or so. So during that time, benefits from trade, deregulation, other economic policies have overwhelmingly gone to the wealthy in the United States. And the result has been a huge increase in inequality over this period, much larger than in other Western democracies. The result is a considerable reduction in the status of working people, as what's happened is that the amount of inequality and the distance between their incomes and that of the wealthy has vastly increased. So over the last 30 years, those in the bottom, let's say 50%, not just the poor, but the relatively poor in the US have gone up very slightly. So if you look at the standard model, they should be happier. But once you take into account status or relative income relationships, then they may not be. So let's look at the rise of populism in the United States. And I just discussed the loss sometimes of income, but especially of status among workers in the US. And white workers in particular had a history in the United States of voting for the Democratic Party. But in the last 30 years or so, the Democratic Party has offered very little to them, especially to white workers without a college degree. Their incomes have gone up over this last 25, 30 years or so, but by very little. At the same time, the incomes of the wealthy have soared. And the figures are in the paper and they're readily available. The figures are very dramatic in terms of just how much the incomes of the wealthy have gone up, and that the incomes of the relatively poor, that is not poor people, but the bottom 50%, have gone up only a little bit, about 18% over the last 30 years, while the incomes of the very wealthy have gone up by something like 400%. But the Democratic Party didn't see this. They thought they're better off, and they were mainly worried, maybe very justifiably, on attracting growing minorities to the Democratic Party. And what Trump saw was this, that there was this group of disaffected, uneducated white workers. They were angry. The thrill is gone. So one half in a recent survey of white Americans, including 60% of white working class Americans, agree with a statement that discrimination against whites has become as big a problem today as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. So the result was the election of Trump, and he's not in power anymore, but he's still very popular in the Republican Party. And there's been a lot of analysis about this. The main conclusion of it is that they're typically not rich, but they are not poor on average. As I said, their incomes went up under the Clinton and Obama administrations. So according to the standard paradigm, where a person's income depends only on his own consumption, these people should be higher, should be happier. The other point is that Trump's own policies did very little that actually made them better off. So they're not much better off than they were before he took office. So the loyalty of these supporters of Trump, and they are extremely loyal. So in a recent poll, 6 out of 10 Republicans still believe that Trump actually won the election and still support him. And so they're not behaving the way the standard transaction or economic model says they should be behaving. The only way I believe to explain their behavior is to use relationships. And Trump supporters identify with him mainly because, number one, Trump is angry. He's always angry. And they are angry. And there was a paper at the AEA meetings in January by Ali Desmet and Washag, where they looked at people and they had data by county in the United States. And they looked at people who were angry for any reason whatsoever. So they could be angry because their wife left them or their husband left them, or they could be angry because their children aren't doing well in school, or they could be angry because they think prices are too high. It doesn't matter what the reason was. They simply classified people into how angry they were, and then they looked at how they voted. And what they found was that people who are angry for any reason at all vote disproportionately for populists. So the first reason that Trump supporters like him is that he's angry, and his anger mimics their anger. And seeing the president of the United States be angry like you and appear to be angry for you gives them a feeling that maybe they're climbing up to the mountain already. They feel they've lost status. In particular, among whites, they've lost a certain white dominance that they used to have. Trump provides the status through his capacity to identify with them, and because in rhetoric and in dog whistles and so on, he identifies with the fact that white people should be dominant. And as you know, many of Trump's advisors were openly white supremacists. And finally, and possibly most importantly, they like the idea of a strongman repressing the people they think are responsible for their problems, namely foreigners and minorities. And a strongman is a leader who can do this, that is, introduce some repression and actually gain power. Not everybody can do it. So in Ontario here, we have a leader called Doug Ford. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He looks like a strong man. He talks like a strong man, and he wants to be a strong man. And last week, he tried to introduce a little repression here. He tried to bring back the idea that the police could stop anybody on the street in order to do something about the COVID phenomenon. And the result was that 30 of the police forces, including Toronto and all the major centers, said they would not do that. And in the end, Doug Ford appeared on TV crying because he said COVID had gotten so bad and he didn't know why. And he immediately reversed himself. So not everybody can introduce repression and gain power. Only some people can do it. And that's how I define a strong man. Doug Ford is not one of them. Anyway, these three ingredients, anger, loss of status, and the desire to repress your enemies, are, I believe, potent forces that can result in the collapse of democracy into authoritarianism, which almost happened in the US and might still happen. Similar things are going on in Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, and I think that this analysis might work for these countries as well, and I hope to investigate that, possibly with your help. Thank you.